The morning air hung crisp and cool over the small town of Pine Ridge, nestled at the edge of the vast Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York. Autumn had painted the landscape in fiery hues of amber and crimson, and the scent of decaying leaves permeated the air. For most residents, it was just another Saturday in October, but for the Morgan family, it would become the day that changed everything. 12-year-old Ethan Morgan zipped up his blue jacket as he stood on the back porch of his family's cabin. His sandy brown hair ruffled in the gentle breeze, and his hazel eyes squinted against the morning sun. Beside him, his loyal German shepherd, Max, panted excitedly, knowing their weekend routine all too well. "Be back for lunch, okay?" Ethan's mother, Sarah, called from inside the kitchen. Her voice carried a hint of the worry that had become habitual since they'd moved from the city 3 months ago. "And keep your phone on." "I will, Mom," Ethan responded with the slight edge of annoyance typical of preteens who feel they're being babied. "Max and I are just going to the creek and back. 2 hours, tops." Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her expression softened as she looked at her son. "I know you're responsible, honey. It's just so easy to get turned around in these woods." Ethan patted the pocket where his new smartphone rested. "GPS, remember? Dad made sure I downloaded all the trail maps." He smiled, his confidence genuine. After all, they'd hiked these trails nearly every weekend since moving here, and Ethan prided himself on his developing outdoor skills. What neither of them mentioned was the real reason for Sarah's concern. Just last year, a child from a neighboring town had wandered off during a family camping trip and wasn't found until 36 hours later, dehydrated and hypothermic. The incident had shaken the entire community, and though Sarah never explicitly forbade Ethan's explorations, her anxiety lingered like a shadow. "All right then. Have fun," she conceded, watching as Ethan and Max bounded down the steps and headed toward the tree line at the edge of their property. She stood there long after they disappeared into the dense forest, the knot in her stomach tightening despite her efforts to relax. Inside the forest, Ethan felt the familiar thrill of adventure wash over him. The woods were his sanctuary, a place where the anxieties of being the new kid at school couldn't follow. Here, with Max trotting beside him, he felt confident and free. The trail to the creek was well marked, a narrow dirt path winding through towering maples and oaks. Ethan knew it by heart now, recognizing landmarks along the way, the oddly shaped boulder that resembled a turtle, the fallen oak that created a natural bridge, the cluster of birch trees standing like sentinels. "Come on, Max," he called as the dog sniffed intently at something beside the path. The shepherd looked up, ears perked, then reluctantly left his discovery to follow his young master. They reached the creek within 30 minutes, right on schedule. The water bubbled over smooth stones, creating a soothing melody that Ethan had come to love. He found his usual spot on a flat rock overlooking a small pool where tiny fish darted in the clear water. Max settled beside him, content to watch the forest and occasionally lap at the cool creek water. Ethan pulled out his sketchbook, another reason for these solo expeditions. Drawing was his passion, and the natural world provided endless inspiration. Today, he wanted to capture the way the sunlight filtered through the canopy, creating dappled patterns on the forest floor. Time slipped away as he sketched, his pencil moving deftly across the paper. When he finally checked his phone, he was surprised to see it was already 11:30. Almost time to head back. It was then that Max's demeanor changed. The dog stood abruptly, ears forward, body tense. A low growl rumbled in his chest. "What is it, boy?" Ethan asked, suddenly alert. Max's behavior usually meant wildlife nearby, perhaps a deer or even a fox. The shepherd barked once, then darted off the trail into the denser underbrush. "Max! Come back!" Ethan called, scrambling to shove his sketchbook into his backpack. This wasn't like Max at all. The well-trained dog rarely disobeyed commands. Something had seriously caught his attention. Without thinking, Ethan plunged into the underbrush after his dog. Branches snagged at his jacket, and fallen leaves concealed dips in the uneven ground, causing him to stumble. "Max," he called again, his voice echoing among the trees. In the distance, he could hear Max barking insistently. Ethan pushed forward, ignoring the scratches on his hands from thorny bushes. The terrain began to slope upward, and the trees grew thicker, blocking more of the sunlight. With a jolt of concern, Ethan realized he had ventured into a part of the forest he didn't recognize. He paused to catch his breath and check his phone. The GPS map showed he had veered significantly off the marked trails. A twinge of worry crept up his spine, but he pushed it aside. He could still hear Max barking, that was what mattered now. What Ethan didn't realize, as he pushed deeper into the unfamiliar woods, was that his phone's battery was rapidly draining in the colder temperature, and that the dense canopy overhead was beginning to interfere with the GPS signal. By the time he found Max, standing at the base of a steep ravine and barking up at something Ethan couldn't see, the situation had become more serious than a simple detour. And when Ethan's foot slipped on the damp leaves at the edge of the ravine, sending him tumbling down the steep embankment in a shower of dirt and stones, what had started as a routine morning hike transformed into a desperate fight for survival. The world spun in a blur of brown and green as Ethan tumbled down the ravine, his body bouncing painfully against rocks and exposed roots. He instinctively curled into a ball, protecting his head with his arms as best he could. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally came to a stop at the bottom, landing with a thud that knocked the wind from his lungs. For several moments, Ethan lay still, afraid to move. Pain radiated from his left ankle and various scrapes burned across his skin, but a quick mental assessment told him nothing seemed broken. Above him, Max's frantic barking echoed down the ravine walls. "I'm okay, Max." Ethan called up, his voice shakier than he intended. He slowly pushed himself into a sitting position, wincing as he tested his ankle. It wasn't broken, but definitely sprained, swollen and painful to put weight on. The ravine bottom was darker than the forest above, with tall walls of earth and stone rising at least 20 feet on either side. Ethan looked around, trying to orient himself. The narrow space stretched in both directions, like a natural corridor cutting through the forest. A small stream trickled along one edge, likely a tributary of the creek he'd been visiting. Above him, Max continued to bark, pacing anxiously at the edge of the ravine. "Stay, Max. Good boy, stay there." Ethan called, afraid the dog might try to follow him down. The last thing he needed was for Max to get hurt too. Reaching for his phone, Ethan felt a surge of panic when his fingers met only the fabric of his empty pocket. The phone must have fallen out during the tumble. He scanned the area around him, spotting it several feet away, partially submerged in the shallow stream. "No, no, no," he muttered, crawling over to retrieve it. The screen was cracked, and despite his attempts to power it on, the device remained dark and unresponsive. The reality of his situation began to sink in. He was injured, without communication, in an unfamiliar part of the forest. Ethan forced himself to take deep breaths, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. Panic wouldn't help him now. What would Dad say? When you're lost, stop, think, observe, plan. He looked up at the ravine walls. Climbing back up with his injured ankle seemed impossible, especially without proper gear. Looking along the ravine floor, he tried to determine which direction might lead to an easier exit point. "Max," he called up. "Go home, boy. Go get Mom. Go home." The shepherd barked in response but made no move to leave. Ethan wasn't surprised. Max was loyal to a fault and wouldn't abandon him. The watch on Ethan's wrist showed 12:15 p.m. His mom would be expecting him back by now, and when he didn't show up, she'd surely come looking. But would she know where to find him? He'd gone completely off trail, and even he wasn't entirely sure where he was. Deciding that staying put might be the safest option, Ethan tried to make himself as comfortable as possible, using his backpack as a cushion. Fortunately, he always packed extra water and snacks, a habit his mother had insisted upon. At least he wouldn't go hungry or thirsty while waiting for rescue. As the minutes ticked by, however, the temperature began to drop noticeably. Weather forecasts had predicted an unseasonably cold front moving in by afternoon, and sitting still on the damp ground was already making Ethan shiver. He needed to find shelter, or at least keep moving to stay warm. Using a sturdy branch as a makeshift crutch, Ethan pulled himself to his feet, testing his weight gingerly on his injured ankle. Pain shot up his leg, but it was bearable if he leaned heavily on the branch. "Max, I'm going to walk along the ravine," he called up. "Follow me up there, okay?" The dog seemed to understand, keeping pace along the edge of the ravine as Ethan began to hobble along its floor. He chose to follow the direction of the small stream, reasoning that water always flowed downhill and eventually led somewhere. The going was slow and painful. The ravine floor was littered with obstacles, fallen branches, slippery rocks, and patches of mud that threatened to swallow his shoes. The walls of earth and stone rose imposingly on either side, occasionally broken by the twisted roots of trees growing at the edge. None offered an easy way out. As Ethan progressed, the ravine gradually widened, and the stream beside him grew slightly larger, fed by smaller trickles coming down the ravine walls. The sky above, visible in a narrow strip between the towering trees at the ravine's edge, had darkened considerably. The predicted cold front was arriving, and with it came the threat of rain. The first fat drops began to fall just as Ethan noticed something strange ahead. Through the increasing gloom, he could make out what appeared to be an anomaly in the otherwise natural landscape of the ravine, straight lines and right angles that didn't belong in this organic environment. As he drew closer, his heart began to race with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. There, half buried in the ravine wall, was what appeared to be a man-made structure. Old, weathered wooden beams protruded from the earth, framing what might once have been an entrance of some kind. Max, still following faithfully along the ravine's edge, began to bark excitedly when Ethan approached the mysterious structure. The rain was falling steadily now, soaking through Ethan's jacket and chilling him to the bone. Whatever this place was, it might offer shelter from the worsening weather. Leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch, Ethan approached the entrance. Years of erosion had partially collapsed the structure, but there was still a gap large enough for him to squeeze through. He hesitated at the threshold, peering into the darkness beyond. Was it safe? What if the whole thing collapsed on him? But as thunder rumbled overhead and the rain intensified, Ethan realized he had little choice. "I'll be right back, Max," he called up reassuringly. "Just going to check if it's safe." With one last glance at his faithful companion, now a drenched silhouette against the darkening sky, Ethan ducked into the mysterious opening, having no idea that what he was about to discover would not only change his life but would challenge everything the people of Pine Ridge thought they knew about the history of their quiet corner of the Adirondacks. The air inside the structure was stale and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Ethan stood just within the entrance, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dimness. Rain pattered against the protruding beams outside, but here he was mercifully dry. As his vision adapted, details of his shelter emerged from the darkness. What he had stumbled upon wasn't a natural cave but something constructed by human hands, and not recently. The space extended about 15 feet into the ravine wall, supported by old timber frames that groaned slightly under the weight of the earth above. The floor was packed dirt, with what appeared to be the remnants of wooden planking in some areas. "Hello?" Ethan called reflexively, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. No response came, save for the continued barking of Max outside. Moving carefully to avoid putting pressure on his injured ankle, Ethan explored the strange room. Against the far wall, he could make out the shapes of what might have been furniture once, now reduced to rotted wood and rusted metal. A table, perhaps, and beside it, the collapsed remains of what could have been a chair or stool. "What is this place?" he whispered to himself, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with his wet clothes. He reached into his backpack and retrieved his flashlight, another item his mother had insisted he always carry. Its beam cut through the gloom, revealing more details of the mysterious structure. The walls weren't merely packed earth, as he'd initially thought. In places, they were lined with rough-hewn wooden panels, most now warped and rotting. In one corner, a small stone hearth was built into the wall, its chimney long since collapsed. Scattered around were artifacts of human habitation, a rusted metal cup, the remains of what might have been tools, and most interestingly, a wooden box that seemed more intact than the rest of the items. Outside, Max's barking had grown more insistent, taking on a different tone that Ethan recognized as the dog's alert for someone approaching. Was it possible? Had his mother already found him? "Mom?" Ethan called out, hobbling quickly toward the entrance. "I'm in here." But when he reached the opening and peered out into the rain, there was only Max, still pacing along the edge of the ravine above, barking not toward the forest but at something else entirely. Following the dog's gaze, Ethan saw it, a thin column of smoke rising above the trees in the distance, barely visible through the rainfall. Smoke meant people. People meant help. For a brief moment, Ethan considered trying to make his way toward the smoke immediately, but reason quickly prevailed. With his injured ankle, the worsening weather, and the unfamiliar terrain, setting out now would be foolish. Better to wait until morning, or at least until the rain stopped. Turning back to the shelter, Ethan decided to make the best of his situation. His camping experiences with his father had taught him the basics of survival. First priority, get warm and dry. Second, take inventory of resources. Third, make a plan. He carefully removed his wet jacket and outer shirt, using the relatively dry t-shirt he'd been wearing underneath to towel himself off as best he could. From his backpack, he pulled out a lightweight emergency thermal blanket, another of his mother's insisted upon items that he was now immensely grateful for. As he worked to make himself comfortable, Ethan's thoughts returned to the wooden box he'd spotted earlier. Curiosity getting the better of him, he shuffled over to examine it more closely. Unlike the other deteriorated items, this box seemed purposely protected, tucked into a small alcove in the wall that had kept it relatively dry over the years. The box was about the size of a shoebox, crafted from dark wood that had weathered the passage of time remarkably well. A simple metal clasp held it closed, now green with oxidation but still intact. With careful fingers, Ethan worked the clasp free and slowly lifted the lid. Inside, protected from the elements, lay several items carefully wrapped in what appeared to be oilcloth. Ethan gently unwrapped the first bundle to reveal a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed but still legible. Next to it was a collection of folded papers, some appearing to be hand-drawn maps, others covered in cramped handwriting. Beneath these was something that made Ethan's breath catch, a photograph, faded and sepia-toned, showing a group of men standing before what appeared to be a mine entrance. Ethan carefully opened the journal, finding a name inscribed on the first page, property of Thomas Blackwell, 1897. The date made him blink in surprise. This place was over 125 years old. Turning the pages carefully, Ethan began to read by the beam of his flashlight. The journal detailed the account of a small, secret mining operation, established by Blackwell and 4 partners. They had discovered a vein of silver in this remote section of the Adirondacks and, fearing claim jumpers and interference from larger mining companies, had established their operation in utmost secrecy. "We have constructed our primary shaft half a mile east of this shelter," one entry read. "The vein appears most promising, though we must work with extreme caution to avoid detection. Rumors of our discovery would bring unwanted attention from Albany and the larger interests that control these mountains in all but name." Ethan's mind raced. A secret silver mine? Here in these woods? It seemed fantastical, yet the evidence was literally in his hands, the journal, the maps, the photograph. This wasn't some supernatural discovery or mythical treasure, it was real history, forgotten by time and buried by nature. A particularly loud clap of thunder made Ethan jump, nearly dropping the journal. Outside, Max's barking had ceased, replaced by anxious whining. The storm was worsening, and Ethan realized with a sinking feeling that any rescue attempt would likely be delayed until weather conditions improved. "It's okay, Max," he called out, though he wasn't sure if the dog could hear him through the intensifying storm. "I'm safe. I'll find a way out tomorrow." As night began to fall, casting the shelter into deeper darkness, Ethan wrapped himself in the thermal blanket and continued reading Thomas Blackwell's journal by flashlight, unaware that his accidental discovery would soon bring to light a chapter of local history that had been deliberately erased, and that the smoke he'd seen rising through the trees would lead him to someone who had been searching for this very place for most of their life. Morning arrived with hesitant sunlight filtering through the clouds, the storm having exhausted itself during the night. Ethan awoke stiff and sore, his ankle throbbing with a dull pain. He had slept fitfully, using his backpack as a pillow and the thermal blanket for warmth, Thomas Blackwell's journal clutched to his chest. His first thought was of Max scrambling to the entrance of the shelter. Ethan called out, "Max! You still there, boy?" To his immense relief, an enthusiastic bark answered him. The loyal German shepherd had remained at his post throughout the night, wet and muddy but seemingly unharmed. "Good boy, Max." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. "I'm going to find a way out, okay?" Assessing his situation in the clear light of day, Ethan knew he needed help. His ankle, while not broken, would make climbing the ravine walls nearly impossible. His best option was to try to reach whoever had made the smoke he'd seen yesterday. After a quick breakfast of granola bars from his backpack and a careful wrapping of his ankle with his spare t-shirt for support, Ethan packed up his belongings, making sure to secure the wooden box and its historical contents. Whatever else happened, he wasn't leaving this discovery behind. Using his makeshift crutch, Ethan emerged from the shelter into the cool morning air. The ravine looked different in daylight, less intimidating, though no less challenging to navigate. The rain had swelled the small stream, making the footing even trickier, but Ethan was determined. "I'm going to try to find help, Max," he called up to his dog. "Follow me along the top." Max barked in response, already trotting along the ravine's edge as Ethan began his slow, painful journey in the direction he'd seen the smoke. The going was arduous, each step a negotiation with pain, but Ethan pushed forward, driven by the dual desires of rescue and of sharing his remarkable discovery. After what seemed like hours but was closer to 45 minutes according to his watch, the ravine began to slope more gently, its walls gradually decreasing in height. Eventually, Ethan found himself at a point where the incline was shallow enough that he might be able to climb out, even with his injured ankle. "Max, come," he called, and the shepherd bounded down the gentle slope, nearly bowling Ethan over in his excitement to finally reach his young master. Ethan buried his face in Max's damp fur, allowing himself a moment of pure relief at being reunited. "Good boy," he whispered. "The best boy." With Max now beside him, Ethan felt a renewed sense of confidence. The dog's presence was comforting, and more practically, Max could potentially run for help if needed. Together they made their way up the sloping end of the ravine, Ethan gritting his teeth against the pain in his ankle. When they finally reached level ground, he paused to catch his breath and get his bearings. The forest here was different, less dense, with signs of human intervention. Some trees had been cleared, creating unnatural gaps in the canopy. "Hello?" Ethan called out, his voice seeming small in the vast forest. "Is anyone there? I need help." Max's ears suddenly perked up, and he turned his head sharply to the right, a low growl building in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered, instantly alert. Was it a wild animal? A bear? The sound of breaking branches and rustling undergrowth grew louder, coming from the direction Max was facing. Ethan held his breath, mentally preparing to either run or stand his ground, depending on what emerged. What stepped into the clearing was not a bear but a human figure, a tall, lean man with a weathered face partially hidden behind a silver-streaked beard. He wore canvas pants, a flannel shirt, and a worn leather vest, with a battered hat shadowing his eyes. In his hand was a walking stick, and slung over his shoulder was what appeared to be a prospector's pack. The man stopped abruptly at the sight of Ethan and Max, his expression shifting from surprise to concern. "Well, I'll be," he said, his voice gravelly but gentle. "What in the world are you doing out here, young man?" Max continued to growl softly, positioning himself protectively in front of Ethan. "It's okay, Max," Ethan said, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's head before addressing the stranger. "I got lost yesterday during the storm. I fell down into a ravine and hurt my ankle. I saw smoke and thought maybe someone could help me." The man's eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Ethan's muddy clothes, the makeshift wrap around his ankle, and the bulging backpack that now contained the wooden box from the shelter. "That'd be my campfire you saw," he said, taking a cautious step forward, hands raised slightly to show he meant no harm. "Name's Robert Harmon. Most folks just call me Old Rob." "I'm Ethan Morgan," Ethan replied, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. "And this is Max. We live in Pine Ridge, just moved there a few months ago." "Pine Ridge?" Rob nodded. "That's about 5 miles northwest of here. You wandered pretty far off the beaten path, son." 5 miles. The realization hit Ethan hard. No wonder his mother would be worried sick. "I need to get home," Ethan said urgently. "My mom's probably called search and rescue by now." "I expect she has," Rob agreed. "But you ain't going far on that ankle. My camp's just a quarter mile from here. Got a radio there? We can call in, let em know you're safe, then get you some proper first aid while we wait for them to come get you." Ethan hesitated, years of stranger danger warnings echoing in his mind. But Max had relaxed somewhat, his growl subsiding to occasional suspicious sniffs in Rob's direction, which Ethan took as a positive sign. And realistically, he had few options. "Okay," he agreed finally. "Thank you." Rob nodded, seemingly understanding Ethan's initial hesitation. "Smart to be cautious," he said. "Tell you what, once we get to camp and radio your folks, you can tell me what you were doing in these parts and how you ended up in that ravine." As they began the slow trek toward Rob's camp, Max walking close by Ethan's side, the weight of the wooden box in his backpack seemed to grow heavier. Should he tell this stranger about what he'd found? The secret mine that had been hidden for over a century? Something told Ethan that Rob Harmon might be more interested in his discovery than he would let on, and for reasons that went beyond simple historical curiosity. Rob's camp was a modest setup in a small clearing, a weathered canvas tent, a carefully constructed fire pit, and various tools and equipment arranged with methodical precision. It had the feel of a place that had been occupied for some time, not just a temporary stopping point. "Sit yourself down there," Rob instructed, gesturing to a log positioned near the smoldering remains of the previous night's fire. "Let me take a look at that ankle before we do anything else." Ethan complied, easing himself onto the log while Max sniffed around the perimeter of the camp, still vigilant but less on edge than before. Rob knelt before Ethan, gently unwrapping the makeshift bandage. His hands were calloused but surprisingly gentle as he examined the swollen joint. "Not broken," he confirmed after careful prodding. "Bad sprain though. You're lucky it ain't worse, considering the tumble you must have taken." From a battered metal box, a first aid kit, Ethan realized, Rob produced a proper elastic bandage and began wrapping the ankle with practiced efficiency. "You seem to know what you're doing," Ethan observed. Rob's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Spent 20 years as a park ranger before retiring. Seen my share of sprains and breaks." He secured the bandage with metal clips. "That should hold until proper medical folks can look at it." As promised, Rob next retrieved a hand-cranked emergency radio from his tent. After several attempts, he managed to connect with the Pine Ridge Emergency Services. The dispatcher on the other end confirmed what Ethan had feared: a full-scale search operation had been launched the previous evening when he hadn't returned home. "Got a lost boy here," Rob explained into the radio. "Ethan Morgan. Found him in the eastern sector, about 5 miles from Pine Ridge. Sprained ankle, otherwise okay. The relief in the dispatcher's voice was palpable as she assured them a rescue team would be dispatched to their GPS coordinates immediately. They should reach you within 2 hours, she added. His mother has been beside herself. Guilt washed over Ethan at the thought of his mother's worry. Can I talk to her? He asked anxiously. But the connection was tenuous at best, and after assuring the dispatcher once more that Ethan was safe, Rob ended the transmission. Sorry, son. These old radios ain't exactly cell phones. But they know you're safe now, and that's what matters. Nodding, Ethan accepted a bottle of water Rob offered him, suddenly aware of how thirsty he was. As he drank, he noticed Rob studying him with curious eyes. So, the older man said finally, stoking the fire back to life, want to tell me how you ended up down in that ravine? Not many folks venture this far out, especially not young fellas like yourself. Ethan hesitated. There was something about Rob that suggested he might have more than a passing interest in the answer. Still, the man had helped him and was being kind. And the discovery felt too significant to keep entirely to himself. I was just hiking with Max, Ethan began carefully. He chased after something, and I followed him off trail. Then I slipped and fell into the ravine. Rob nodded, seemingly accepting this explanation. And you spent the night where? It was a mean storm. I found shelter, Ethan said, choosing his words deliberately. Some kind of old structure built into the ravine wall. At this, Rob's casual demeanor shifted subtly. He became very still, his weathered hands pausing in the act of feeding a stick into the fire. A structure, you say? His voice was carefully neutral. Like what, an old hunter's blind? No, Ethan replied, watching Rob's reaction closely. It was bigger. Like a room dug into the earth, with wooden supports. Really old. Rob's eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. He poked at the fire for a moment before asking, with studied casualness, find anything in there? The question confirmed Ethan's suspicion. Rob wasn't just making conversation, he was fishing for specific information. But why? What would a retired park ranger care about an abandoned structure in the woods? Deciding to test the waters, Ethan said, there was some old stuff. Broken furniture. Rusted tools. Rob nodded, his expression revealing nothing. Probably just an old trapper's cabin that got buried over time. These mountains have a long history of folks living off the grid. But something in the way he said it, too dismissive, too quick to offer an explanation, made Ethan certain that Rob knew more than he was letting on. The wooden box in his backpack seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. An uncomfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the crackling of the revived fire and Max's occasional snuffling as he continued to explore the campsite. Finally, Ethan made a decision. Reaching into his backpack, he withdrew the wooden box. I found this, he said simply, placing it on the log beside him. Rob's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His eyes widened, and he reached out with barely concealed eagerness before catching himself and withdrawing his hand. May I? He asked, his casual tone belied by the intensity of his gaze. Ethan nodded, and Rob carefully took the box, examining it with reverent hands before opening the clasp to reveal the contents, the journal, the maps, the photograph. Thomas Blackwell's journal, Ethan explained, watching Rob closely. It talks about a secret silver mine they established in 1897. Rob's fingers trembled slightly as he gently lifted the journal. Blackwell, he whispered, almost to himself. Then, looking up at Ethan with new eyes, do you have any idea what you've stumbled upon, son? A forgotten piece of history? Ethan ventured. Rob shook his head slowly, a mixture of emotions playing across his weathered face. Not just history, boy. My history. He tapped the faded photograph. See that man there, standing to the left of Blackwell? That's Edward Harmon. My great-grandfather. The revelation hit Ethan like a physical force. Your great-grandfather was one of the miners? Yes. Rob's voice had grown hoarse. And I've been searching for proof of that mine for over 30 years. His eyes, when they met Ethan's, were intense with a lifetime of purpose. Everyone in town thought it was just a legend, the story of a secret silver mine that disappeared without a trace. My family knew better, but we never had proof. Until now. Outside the camp, the distant sound of voices and dogs barking signaled the approach of the rescue team, but in that moment, sitting before the fire with the physical evidence of a long-buried secret between them, Ethan understood that his accidental discovery had set in motion events that would forever change both his life and the history of Pine Ridge. The search and rescue team arrived with efficiency born of practice, 2 park rangers, a paramedic, and 3 volunteers from Pine Ridge, accompanied by a search dog whose excitement at finding Ethan was second only to Max's joy at seeing more people. Ethan Morgan? The lead ranger, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, approached while the paramedic immediately moved to check Ethan's ankle. I'm Ranger Martinez. Your mother's been worried sick. Is she here? Ethan asked anxiously, scanning the group. No, she's at the command center we set up near your home. She wanted to come, but we needed her there in case you turned up in a different sector. The ranger's expression softened slightly. She'll meet us at the trailhead when we get you out. The paramedic, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, carefully examined Rob's bandaging job. Not bad, he commented. You've had some first aid training? Former ranger, Rob explained, standing slightly apart from the group, the wooden box now conspicuously absent from sight. Before the rescue team had arrived, he had quickly but carefully returned the box to Ethan's backpack with a whispered, "Not a word about this yet. Please." While the paramedic fashioned a more elaborate ankle support and the team prepared a portable stretcher, Ranger Martinez took statements from both Ethan and Rob, noting down the sequence of events in her official log. You're lucky Mr. Harmon found you, she said to Ethan. These woods are easy to get turned around in, especially during bad weather. Mr. Harmon, one of the volunteers spoke up, a stocky man with a Pine Ridge search and rescue jacket. Robert Harmon? He squinted at Rob with sudden recognition. I thought you left the area years ago. Rob shifted uncomfortably. Been back about 6 months, he said shortly. Keeping to myself mostly. The volunteer nodded, though his expression suggested there was more to the story. Ethan, observing the interaction, added another piece to the puzzle of Rob Harmon. Apparently, his return to the area was recent, and perhaps not widely known. Once Ethan was secured on the stretcher, the team began the careful journey back toward Pine Ridge, taking turns carrying the stretcher over the uneven terrain. Max trotted alongside, occasionally glancing back as if to ensure Ethan was still with them. To Ethan's surprise, Rob fell into step beside the procession. You're coming too? Ethan asked quietly when they were out of earshot of the others. Rob nodded, his expression unreadable. Got some business in town I've been putting off. He glanced meaningfully at Ethan's backpack, which one of the volunteers was carrying. And I reckon you and I need to finish our conversation. The journey back to civilization took nearly 2 hours, winding along established trails that Ethan realized, with some chagrin, weren't that far from where he'd originally gone off course. Had he just stayed on the marked paths, none of this would have happened. Yet, had he done so, the secret mine might have remained hidden for another century. As they approached the trailhead, Ethan could see the makeshift command center, several vehicles, including his mother's blue SUV, park ranger trucks, and an ambulance. And there, pacing anxiously beside her car, was Sarah Morgan. The moment she spotted the approaching group, she broke into a run. Ethan! Oh my God, Ethan! The search team carefully lowered the stretcher, and Sarah was there instantly, wrapping Ethan in a fierce hug that threatened to squeeze the breath from him. I'm okay, Mom, he managed, returning the embrace with equal fervor. Really? Just a sprained ankle. Sarah pulled back, her face a battlefield of relief and lingering fear, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. When you didn't come home, and then the storm hit. She cupped his face in her hands. I was so scared. I know. I'm sorry, Ethan said, guilt washing over him anew. Max ran off, and I followed him, and then I fell. It doesn't matter, she interrupted, pulling him close again. You're safe. That's all that matters right now. Over his mother's shoulder, Ethan saw Rob standing apart from the group, watching the reunion with an inscrutable expression. Their eyes met briefly, and Rob gave an almost imperceptible nod before turning to speak with Ranger Martinez. The paramedics insisted on transporting Ethan to the local clinic for a proper examination, despite his protests that he was fine. Sarah rode in the ambulance with him, holding his hand the entire way, while Max was loaded into their SUV, which one of the volunteers offered to drive to the clinic. At the clinic, the doctor confirmed what Rob had already determined, a significant sprain that would require a walking boot and several weeks of limited activity, but no permanent damage. While Ethan was being fitted for the boot, Sarah stepped out to complete paperwork, leaving him momentarily alone. It was then that there was a soft knock at the examination room door, and Rob Harmon slipped in, closing the door quietly behind him. They're about to discharge you, he said without preamble. I don't have much time. Did you follow us to the clinic? Ethan asked, surprised. Had to, Rob replied, his voice low and urgent. Listen, Ethan, what you found, that journal, those maps, they're incredibly important. Not just to me, but potentially to the whole town. Because of the silver mine? Rob nodded, glancing toward the door to ensure they weren't overheard. The mine was real. My family knew it all along, but without proof, we were dismissed as crackpots chasing legends. His expression hardened. There are folks in Pine Ridge, powerful folks, who've worked hard to bury that history for generations. Folks who might not be happy about what you've discovered. Ethan frowned, trying to process this information. Why would anyone care about an old abandoned mine? Because it might not be as abandoned as everyone thinks, Rob said cryptically. And because history has a way of exposing uncomfortable truths. He reached into his pocket and produced a business card with a phone number scrawled on the back. Call me when you're ready to talk more. And Ethan, his voice dropped even lower, keep that box safe. Don't show it to anyone else. Not yet. Before Ethan could respond, the door opened, and Sarah returned, stopping short at the sight of Rob. Oh, hello, she said, clearly surprised to find a stranger in her son's room. Mom, Ethan said quickly, this is Mr. Harmon. He's the one who found me and helped me. Sarah's expression immediately transformed from suspicion to gratitude. Mr. Harmon, thank you so much for helping my son. I don't know how to repay you. Rob shook his head, already backing toward the door. No need for thanks, ma'am. Just glad the boy's safe. He nodded to Ethan, his eyes communicating volumes. You take care of that ankle now, Ethan. And remember what I said. As Rob disappeared through the doorway, Ethan was left with the business card clutched in his hand and the growing certainty that his accidental discovery in the ravine was about to unveil secrets that some in Pine Ridge would prefer stayed buried, literally and figuratively. The week following Ethan's rescue passed in a blur of concerned visits, repeated tellings of his adventure, carefully edited to omit any mention of the wooden box, and enforced rest for his ankle. His father, who had been away on a business trip during the ordeal, returned home early and barely let Ethan out of his sight for the first few days. Through it all, the wooden box remained hidden beneath Ethan's bed, its contents untouched since his return. Rob Harmon's warning echoed in his mind each time he considered examining the materials again or sharing his discovery with his parents. The business card with Rob's number lay folded in Ethan's wallet, a constant reminder of unfinished business. By Friday afternoon, the household had begun to settle back into normal routines. Ethan's mother had returned to her remote work schedule, his father was catching up on missed assignments, and Ethan himself was growing restless with confinement. "Mom," he called from his position on the living room couch, where he'd been stationed with his laptop and a stack of make-up schoolwork, "can I go to the library tomorrow? I need some books for this history assignment." Sarah looked up from her computer at the dining table, her expression hesitant. "I don't know, honey. Your ankle is fine with the boot," Ethan finished. "The doctor said I should start moving around more, remember? And the library's right downtown. You can drop me off on your way to the grocery store." After some negotiation, Sarah agreed to the plan, on the condition that Ethan promised to stay put at the library until she picked him up. What she didn't know was that Ethan's sudden interest in the library had little to do with his history assignment and everything to do with researching Pine Ridge's past, specifically, its mining history. The following morning, Ethan found himself at a table in the Pine Ridge Public Library, surrounded by local history books and archives of the town's newspaper dating back to the late 1800s. His ankle, encased in the walking boot, throbbed dully as he pored over the materials, searching for any mention of Thomas Blackwell, Edward Harmon, or a silver mine. The results were puzzling. While he found references to other mining operations in the area during that period, there was virtually nothing about Blackwell or his partners. It was as if they had never existed, or had been deliberately erased from the town's records. "Need help finding something specific?" Ethan looked up to see an elderly librarian standing beside his table, eyeing the spread of historical materials with interest. "I'm researching old mines around Pine Ridge," Ethan explained. "Specifically from the 1890s. The woman, her name tag identified her as Mrs. Winters, nodded thoughtfully. "The logging industry gets most of the attention in our local history, but there was certainly mining activity too." She gestured to his materials. "Finding what you need?" "Not really," Ethan admitted. "I'm looking for information about a specific mine or miners. Names like Thomas Blackwell or Edward Harmon? Around 1897? Mrs. Winters' expression changed subtly, a flicker of recognition quickly masked. "Blackwell," she repeated. "That's not a name I've heard in a very long time." She glanced around the nearly empty library before lowering her voice. "You might want to check the Historical Society archives. They're not public access, but—" She disappeared among the stacks, returning moments later with a thin, leather-bound volume. "This isn't in our catalog," she said quietly, placing it before Ethan. "Consider it an unofficial loan. Just bring it back directly to me." The book was titled Pine Ridge, The Forgotten Chronicles, by Margaret Winters, published in 1972. With a jolt, Ethan realized the author must be related to the librarian helping him. "My mother's work," Mrs. Winters confirmed, seeing his reaction. She was quite the local historian, much to the annoyance of certain influential families. This volume was suppressed, shall we say. The few existing copies are family heirlooms now. Thanking her profusely, Ethan began to carefully examine the book. Unlike the official histories, this volume contained an entire chapter dedicated to the Blackwell-Harmon silver venture, complete with references to documents and testimonies that appeared nowhere else in the public record. According to Margaret Winters' research, Blackwell and his partners had indeed discovered a significant silver deposit in the remote eastern section of what would later become part of the Adirondack Park. They had operated in secret for nearly 2 years, extracting a substantial amount of silver before an unexplained incident in 1899 led to the abandonment of the mine. Most intriguingly, the book suggested that the mine's closure coincided with the rise to prominence of the Caldwell family, who would go on to become the wealthiest and most influential family in Pine Ridge for generations. The timing of James Caldwell's sudden financial ascension, coupled with the disappearance of all 5 members of the mining consortium, raises questions that have never been satisfactorily answered, Margaret Winters had written. More disturbing still is the systematic erasure of these events from official town records in the years that followed. Ethan's heart raced as he read these passages. This wasn't just a story about a forgotten mine, it was potentially a century-old cover-up. He was so absorbed in the book that he barely noticed someone taking a seat across from him until a familiar voice spoke. "Found something interesting, I see." Ethan's head snapped up to find Rob Harmon sitting there, his expression unreadable beneath his weathered features. "You didn't call," Rob said simply. "I was going to," Ethan replied, keeping his voice low. "After I did some research." Rob nodded toward the book. Margaret Winters. Brave woman. Caused quite a stir with that book back in the day. His eyes met Ethan's with sudden intensity. She died in a house fire not long after it was published. Officially ruled an accident. A chill ran down Ethan's spine. "Are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything," Rob cut him off. "Just stating facts." He leaned forward. "Have you told anyone about what you found?" "No," Ethan assured him. "The box is still hidden in my room." Relief flickered across Rob's face. "Good. Because things are happening, Ethan. Your discovery has stirred the waters. I've been making calls to some people I trust, historians, a lawyer, a journalist I know from Albany. We need to handle this carefully." "Handle what carefully?" Ethan asked, confusion and a touch of fear mingling in his chest. "It's just an old mine." Rob shook his head slowly. "It's never just anything when it comes to buried secrets and old money." He glanced around before sliding a newspaper clipping across the table. This was in yesterday's business section. The headline read, "Caldwell Mining Corporation announces exploratory operations in eastern Adirondacks." The article detailed how Mason Caldwell, current CEO of the family company, had secured permits for limited mineral exploration in areas remarkably close to where Ethan had fallen into the ravine. Coincidence? Rob asked grimly. "I think not. Someone knows something, and they're moving fast." Before Ethan could respond, Mrs. Winters appeared at their table, her expression tense. "Mr. Harmon," she greeted stiffly. "I thought that might be you." She lowered her voice. "You should know that Richard Caldwell just came in. He's at the front desk asking about recent visitors researching local mining history." Rob's face hardened. "Time to go," he said to Ethan, standing quickly. "Is there a back way out of here?" Mrs. Winters nodded. "Through the reference section." "I'll distract him." As they hurriedly gathered Ethan's things, Rob whispered urgently, "We need that box, Ethan. Today. Those documents might be the only proof of what really happened back then." Ethan hesitated, torn between the mystery unfolding before him and the promise he'd made to his mother to stay at the library until she picked him up. "Trust me," Rob pressed. "This isn't just about an old silver mine anymore. It's about justice, for my family, and maybe for others." Looking into the older man's earnest eyes, Ethan made his decision. As Mrs. Winters engaged a tall, expensively dressed man at the front desk, Ethan and Rob slipped quietly through the reference section and out the emergency exit into the alley behind the library, stepping from the quiet world of historical research into what was rapidly becoming a very present danger. The rain began as a gentle mist as Rob's weathered pickup truck wound through the streets of Pine Ridge, away from the library and toward the Morgan family's cabin on the outskirts of town. Ethan sat tensely in the passenger seat, his crutches propped against the door, the walking boot making his position awkward. "My parents aren't home," Ethan explained as they pulled into the driveway. "Mom's at the grocery store, and Dad's at a meeting in Albany. He won't be back until dinner." Rob nodded, scanning the surroundings with practiced caution before shutting off the engine. "Let's make this quick then." Inside the cabin, Ethan led Rob to his bedroom, where he knelt awkwardly beside the bed and pulled out the wooden box from its hiding place. Placing it on the bed, he watched as Rob carefully examined the contents again, handling each document with reverence. "We need to make copies of everything," Rob said, looking up at Ethan. "Digital backups, at minimum. Got a phone with a decent camera?" Ethan nodded, retrieving his smartphone. Under Rob's direction, he methodically photographed each page of the journal, each map, and the photograph, uploading the images to a secure cloud storage account Rob had prepared. "Now what?" Ethan asked once they'd finished. Rain pattered more insistently against the windows, the sky darkening with the approaching storm, both literal and figurative. Rob carefully repacked the box. "Now we go public with this, but strategically. I've arranged to meet with a journalist and a historian from Albany State University this evening. They're waiting at a motel just outside town. You want me to come with you?" Ethan asked, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "You found it, Ethan. It's your discovery. And frankly," Rob added, his expression grim, "after what happened at the library, I don't think you'd be any safer staying here alone." The seriousness of Rob's tone sent a shiver down Ethan's spine. Was the situation really that dangerous? Could a century-old secret about a silver mine truly matter so much that it would put him at risk? As if reading his thoughts, Rob placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "The Caldwells have built their empire on the foundation of that silver that was stolen, not discovered. Your evidence threatens a narrative they've maintained for generations." Ethan nodded, making his decision. "Let me write my parents a note explaining where I've gone." He paused, considering. "Well, not exactly where, but enough so they won't worry." As Ethan scribbled a note explaining that he was with the man who had rescued him, helping with an important historical discovery, and would be home by evening, Rob received a text that made his expression darken. "We need to move," he said urgently. "My contact at the town clerk's office says Richard Caldwell just requested immediate access to all property records for the eastern sector. They're moving faster than I expected." They were just heading for the door when Max, who had been dozing in the living room, suddenly stood alert, his ears perked and a low growl building in his throat. "Someone's coming," Rob whispered, moving to peek through the front curtains. His body tensed. Black SUV, tinted windows. "Not your mother's car." Ethan's heart raced. "What do we do?" "Back door," Rob decided, grabbing the wooden box. "Now." They slipped out the rear entrance just as a car door slammed in the front. Cutting across the backyard, they made for the tree line, Max leading the way with uncanny awareness of the urgency. The rain had intensified, providing cover but also making the ground treacherous, especially for Ethan with his walking boot. Once within the shelter of the forest, Rob led them along a narrow game trail, moving with the confidence of someone intimately familiar with these woods. Despite the pain in his ankle, Ethan kept pace, driven by a mixture of fear and a growing sense that he was part of something monumentally important. After 20 minutes of careful progress through the wet underbrush, they emerged onto a secondary road where Rob's truck was parked. He had apparently moved it here while Ethan was writing his note, anticipating the need for a quick escape. "The motel is about 30 minutes north," Rob explained as they drove, wipers struggling against the downpour. "My contacts are historians, not sensationalists. They understand the significance of what we've found." Ethan nodded, watching the familiar landscapes of Pine Ridge recede in the side mirror, replaced by the denser forests of the outer Adirondacks. Max sat in the narrow back seat, occasionally whining softly as if sensing the tension. "There's something I still don't understand," Ethan said after a period of silence. "Why didn't your family ever come forward before? Why not tell the truth about what happened?" Rob's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "They tried. My grandfather, Edward's son, spent years trying to find proof of what his father had told him. But all records had vanished. Without evidence, it was just a bitter man's accusation against the most powerful family in the county." He glanced at Ethan. "The Caldwells have owned judges, police chiefs, and newspaper editors in Pine Ridge for generations. Speaking out against them came with consequences. The implications of this settled heavily in the truck's cabin. What had begun as an accidental discovery during a hike had evolved into something with far-reaching implications for an entire community." As they approached the motel, a modest establishment set back from the main highway, Ethan noticed another vehicle already parked in the lot, a blue sedan with Albany plates. Rob's contacts had arrived. "Ready for this?" Rob asked, pulling into a parking space. Ethan took a deep breath, looking down at the wooden box in his lap, a time capsule of truth that had waited over a century to be revealed. "Yes," he said, with more confidence than he felt. "It's time." The meeting that followed in room 14 of the Pinewood Motel would later be described in the Albany Tribune as the beginning of the most significant historical revelation in Adirondack history. Professor Eleanor Jenkins, a specialist in New York industrial history, and Michael Torrance, an investigative journalist known for exposing corporate malfeasance, listened with increasing amazement as Ethan recounted finding the shelter and the box, while Rob provided the historical context passed down through generations of his family. The evidence was irrefutable. The journal, the maps, the photograph, all provided concrete proof that the Blackwell-Harmon Mining Consortium had indeed discovered and operated a silver mine that later became the foundation of the Caldwell fortune. More disturbing were Thomas Blackwell's final journal entries, which hinted at threats and sabotage from unnamed, powerful interests in the weeks before the mine's mysterious abandonment. "This isn't just a historical correction," Torrance said, taking careful notes. "If what you're suggesting is true, that the Caldwells essentially stole this mine through violence or sabotage, it has legal implications even today. Property obtained through criminal means doesn't magically become legitimate with the passage of time." Professor Jenkins nodded, handling the century-old documents with professional care. "And with the Caldwells now seeking to reopen mining operations in the same area, the timing couldn't be more significant." She looked at Ethan with genuine admiration. "Young man, your accidental discovery may well rewrite the economic history of this entire region." As the adults discussed publication strategies and legal protections, Ethan found himself staring out the rain-streaked motel window, watching as the storm gradually began to clear, patches of blue appearing between dark clouds. In that moment, he understood that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not because we're searching for them, but because we're willing to follow unexpected paths, even when they lead us off the familiar trails into territories both dangerous and transformative. 3 days later, when the Albany Tribune published its front-page exposé titled, "Silver Secrets: How One Boy's Discovery Unveiled a Century of Deception," accompanied by Michael Torrance's meticulously researched account and photographs of the Blackwell documents, Ethan stood beside his parents and Rob Harmon as they faced a gathering of reporters outside the Pine Ridge Historical Society. The wooden box and its contents, now securely preserved in archival materials, were officially donated to the Society for permanent exhibition. The Caldwell Mining Corporation announced the suspension of its exploratory operations the same day, and within weeks, legal proceedings would begin that would eventually lead to a significant settlement with the descendants of the original mining consortium, including the Harmon family. For Ethan Morgan, who had simply wanted to sketch by a creek on an autumn morning, life would never be quite the same. His adventure had brought to light not just a forgotten mine, but a forgotten truth, that history is often shaped not by what actually happened, but by who gets to tell the story, and that sometimes it takes a child's accidental discovery to correct the record and restore justice to those who had been silenced for generations. If you've made it this far, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss our next stories. Leave us a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. Your support inspires us to keep creating content like this. Thank you for being here with us.